I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Today, we have the pleasure of talking with Zoë Towns. Zoë is the executive director of Forward.us, a bipartisan political advocacy organization committed to reducing America's incarceration rate. Zoë has been with Forward for a few years, where she launched the Criminal Justice Reform Portfolio and helped define its advocacy, policy, research, and philanthropic agenda. In her years since, Zoë has overseen administrative, ballot, electoral, and legislative criminal justice reform campaigns in states across the country and at the federal level. Before joining Forward.us, Zoë was the Criminal Justice Project Director at the Pew Charitable Trust, and she was also the inaugural director of the Bronx Freedom Fund. And I'm also excited to announce that she's a former Bronx defender, which makes us sort of connected colleagues, kind of, sort of, because we're both Bronx defenders. And once a Bronx defender, always a Bronx defender. So I am so excited to have you on the show, Zoë. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for the conversation.
And one of the reasons I asked you to come on Just Justice is because Forward just released a terrific report called We Can't Afford It: Mass Incarceration and the Family Tax. And I'm so excited to talk with you about this report and also about the work of Forward in general. And so maybe we should actually start there. For our listeners who don't know about what Forward.us does, could you just give us an overview?
Sure. So what we work on two issues on immigration reform and criminal justice reform. Obviously, those are two issues that are intertwined in so many ways, and that's increasingly becoming evident to so many Americans as so much of this immigration enforcement unfurls in through the criminal justice system. Our goals are really to try to advance sort of practical and common sense and broadly backed solutions that will make these failed systems work better for more people. We think that they are interrupting opportunity for far too many American families, and that we could do much better for our communities. So that's the work that we're in. We do a lot of legislative work, a lot of research. We work at the federal level and in states and localities across the country.
So you guys are busy.
It's been a busy time.
I'm not really laughing. I just am laughing because otherwise I'd be crying. It's a tough time right now in the immigration space, and there is such overlap and intersection. And I guess we could do a whole nother show on that. But before we even sort of, we'll put that aside. We'll see how we do on the time front, because I really want to get into some of the findings of this terrific report, We Can't Afford It: Mass Incarceration and the Family Tax. And I'm just wondering, what made you decide to look at the costs of mass incarceration, not just from the correctional and jails perspective, but really the macro cost of putting so many people in our jails and prisons?
There's a few reasons, sort of origin stories at Forward that landed us at this research project. And I would say that the first one is back in 2017, quite a while ago, we were asking the question, we were looking around the room and we were saying, wow, a lot of us have experienced incarceration, not directly, but by through members in our family, sort of had this indirect experience with incarceration. And we kind of thought, how many people have had that experience? It seems like maybe it's actually must be quite a few. And we decided to design this survey in partnership with Cornell University, that asked people, did like a sort of big national survey asking people to respond around direct family experience with incarceration. Has somebody in your immediate family been incarcerated or prison and jail? And we thought the number would be high, and we thought the number would be surprising. We kind of anticipated this could be as high as 1 in 5, 1 in 4. And then it came back that it was 1 in 2. And that was pretty astonishing for us. But when we began to socialize that number, We heard a lot of people just say like, yeah, actually that makes sense. Like, look around this room, look around that room, and we found that even just sort of talking about that number and the pervasiveness and the extraordinary overexposure of this experience in this country helped to just by naming it, sort of destigmatize it, bring people sort of out of a shadow. And just to validate people's experiences, right? And so that was a project that we worked on that we released in 2018 and did a lot of work around. And as we engaged with a lot of our partners and community members and the folks that we met through that project, so many sort of ancillary experiences and consequences of that family contact could have came up in conversation, right? So that's one thread that like we continue to be curious about that experience, which I think is an undertold story in America. And the second thread is really around trying to appreciate the high cost and low returns of our incarceration rates. So we, for a long time, I'm talking about are just like broadly the criminal justice reform movement for a long time has tried to calculate and communicate to policymakers and the public about just how expensive it is to operate prisons and jails and just what low public safety returns that they deliver. And oftentimes, we have done that by calculating this expenditures that states spend on prisons, or that localities spend on jail, or the federal government spends on the Bureau of Prisons, and maybe we've included, probation and parole provision. We have these numbers that we have circulated, and they are really big numbers. Like that alone is quite commanding. 89 billion potentially in state expenditures on corrections, for example is a motivating number and has been a motivating number for state lawmakers for years. And yet we know that that is such a precise and specific piece of a much larger cost and experience. What's not calculated in that is sort of like what happens to education costs when you have super high incarceration rates, or healthcare costs when you have super high incarceration rates, or the hit on local businesses. So many things that need to be properly accounted for. One of the pieces that we wanted to spend a lot of time on was returning again to this experience of family members, because we knew that these state expenditure costs and this big kind of prisons and jails brick and mortar and operation cost number that is so often cited is an important number, and is a number that does not begin to explain it covers maybe the food that the prison provides for people who are incarcerated there, but we know so much about the needs that family members have to step in and cover, whether it's food, medical care, basic provision of things like fans and just like inhumanely hot circumstances, or coats in humanely cold circumstances. Not to mention the phone calls and package costs and email costs, and not to mention the cost that those families have to spend to go and visit their loved ones. And all of that is before you begin to calculate the costs associated with that person's absence. You pull somebody out of a family, and you're not just losing their income, you might be losing another childcare provider, right? So what happens to those hours of the day? How do we accommodate for that when we've got children in the house, or elderly people that need care in the house? What happens to the sort of the when you end up taking on that childcare? Does that mean that your job ends up suffering? And so we did another survey, this time in partnership with Duke University, and sat down with. First, we did a round of focus groups and sort of asked, impacted family members to try to give us a sense of what are the kinds of costs that came up for you when you lived through this incarceration, or as you are still living through your loved one's incarceration. And then we used that to inform a national survey, and that we then did, and got a whole bunch of extraordinarily rich data back that is, I think, stills the mind on just how debilitating and how extraordinarily costly these rates of incarceration are on the family members themselves. Of course, we're all, all of us are paying taxes. We're all having to pay for it that way. But those of us who have had, or have people who are in behind bars right now, are paying this additional extraordinary tax to make this to pay for this incarceration.
Whew. There's a lot that you just said that we are going to go back over and unpack, because it's just so much to think about and get your head around. So I first want to just pause on that 2018 study. 1 in 2 Americans has spent at least one night in jail or prison. Think about
It's one.
that,
It's one in two
right?
American. It's 1 in 2 Americans have an immediate family member who has spent time in jail or prison.
Thank you for that correction. And that's extraordinary, right? I mean, so that
Yes.
means listeners, think about it. Do you have someone in your immediate family who has spent even one night in jail? And I'm going to say a lot of us do. So that's just amazing. And it's really important to kind of center on that number because it means that the rest of this conversation is really pertinent, not just to those people who have family members who are in prison, but it really is pertinent to all of us. So thank you for sort of framing that from the outset. And then the other thing I just want to pause on is I don't know, $89 billion refers to the cost that states, is it include the federal BOP or just states?
Just states.
So the 89 billion with a B dollars goes just to jail and correctional spending. That's your money, people, taxpayer dollars that are going to support all of these prisons and jails. And then what we're going to talk about is all of these additional costs that you kind of sort of highlighted, and it is extraordinary, right? I mean, it's really extraordinary when you add in all of the other uncounted fiscal costs. And on a macro level, so we're going to get into how much it costs families per year on average in just a second. But on a macro level, how much do you estimate that incarceration costs families per year? If we're going to add it all up.
So that survey returned a pretty astonishing number. It showed that incarceration costs families nearly $350 billion, and that number is inclusive of lost earnings as well as direct spending each year. And that figure. We believe can only be deepening the economic precarity that so many people are feeling right now, and having intergenerational impacts on people's economic thriving and potential.
Right. So $348 billion winds up on the shoulders of family members who have loved ones who are in prison. And you said, some of that is income loss, directly lost from the person who's incarcerated, right? But there's all of these other associated costs. Some of it has to do with bail, right? How does bail factor in?
Yep. So there's costs at so many stages of the system. Of course, many people have become educated about cash bail and bail bonds, and how family members in times of extraordinary duress have to find money in order to secure freedom for people who are still in a phase of legal innocence and are hoping to fight their cases from home. There's that money. There's money for attorneys. There's once a person is incarcerated, there are very, very, very basic needs that go unmet in that setting, whether it's related to clothing or food or toothpaste or feminine hygiene products or medical care. There's co-pays. There's like I was saying before, in some places, I mean, and probably most places, but certainly when you're talking about, a prison in the South in the summertime that is not air conditioned, um, there's things like fans that become, quite frankly, life saving. There's in elsewhere in colder places, having boots for the winter that are not provided for by the correctional facility, having jackets, things like that, things to keep you warm. And then of course there are these huge taxes on families for wanting to and attempting to stay in touch with their loved one. We know it's so important for the families at home and so important for the family member behind bars to maintain these ties. And unfortunately, there's been a tremendous amount of predatory practice as it relates to phone calls and the rates that private companies charge for people to make phone calls, to send emails, right? Like we all have in the free world have this extraordinary, sort of basic, uh, capacity to communicate for free. We don't even have to pay for stamps anymore. We send an email to somebody, and to do that inside often costs a lot of money. To receive videos from people, to send packages, put money on somebody's books, like commissary funds and things like that, comes with a levies of a tax levied on that, not like a fee levied on that by private private companies. So all of that adds up to a pretty debilitating bill.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Again, for folks who just aren't really aware of those associated costs, like think about it. If a woman is incarcerated and she needs feminine products, she has to pay for them. And it's not the same cost as if you were going to your local CVS or Walmart or whatever. I mean, there's actually a much higher price tag in prison. So folks who have no access to income or very limited, they're being paid less than $1 an hour for their work inside have to actually come up with money to buy things like feminine products. And the larger ticket items, like Zoe's talking about, like a fan, that can be exponentially more expensive in prison than it is on the outside. And so there's all of these costs that have to get picked up by somebody, or else the person doesn't goes without. And family members who are often struggling on the outside do what they can to supplement. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about this report is sort of that commitment from families to do what they can to support the folks on the inside. Um, and you know, before we before we leave this topic of this macro analysis, you also sort of, and when I say macro, I'm talking about like that big number, that $348 billion number. It There's also immediate shocks. That's what the report calls it, immediate shocks from incarceration. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us about those too, so that the listeners really get a sense. Like when someone is taken into prison, a whole bunch of things kick in. There's all these costs associated with them being in prison, but then there's all these things that happen to the family unit left behind.
Yes, I mentioned some of these before, but just to slow down on them, there's you immediately lose potentially somebody's income. I mean, and this is all in addition to just the extraordinary. I don't want to put to the side the extraordinary trauma and destabilization of losing the family member themselves. But just financially speaking, you're losing that person's income potentially, losing that person's capacity to support the family in other ways, including childcare or elder care, including helping out around the house in ways that can be fiscally, quantified. Um, not to mention some of the shock costs that you already mentioned, Jessica, like bail costs and things that come right up front and come quite quickly.
And also, isn't there sometimes sort of like when a family member is incarcerated, that can leave the remaining folks behind homeless, right? I mean, that can or create incredible housing instability and costs associated with being homeless and having to move.
Of course, depending on how your family income is structured, for some people, the loss of that income and that provider can be like immediately destabilizing, and in the sense of who is paying the bills tomorrow, who is paying the mortgage or the rent tomorrow, and can we? And what we saw from this report was just that maybe is not surprising, but bears paying a lot of attention to, is that homelessness, which so many people are rightly concerned with right now, and trying to understand what might interrupt these tragically high homelessness rates, is driven meaningfully by our incarceration rates. When you sort of take people out of families and destabilize families in that way, financially and otherwise, that it is a massive driver of homelessness in this country.
Right. And so, it's so interesting because people sort of don't make these connections, but they are so connected, right? Homelessness seems like it's an other idea. And then there's the criminal justice system and the legal system over here. And they're really so often intertwined when you peel back the layers of what people are encountering. So we've got this huge number, this $348 billion sort of macro assessment of costs for families. But what does that mean for individual families? Sort of how much is an individual family with an incarcerated loved one typically, on average, paying a year?
So we found that on average, people with an immediate family member in prison are spending over $4,000 annually. Um, that is more, just to put it in perspective, right? That's more than a quarter of the income of someone who is living at the federal poverty line. I think it's important to note that because of how incarceration disproportionately hits communities, and you can find this from our initial report that I referenced in 2018, which is called Every Second, and you can find it every second. .forward.us, but that report talked about sort of who experiences incarceration in their families is more likely to, and if you are those incarceration, family exposure rates are 1 and 2, they're 2 and 3. If you are a Black family, they are uh, higher if you are living in poverty, and higher if you are living in the South, for example. So we know that. This $4,000, which is I think a lot for anybody or for a lot of people, is also in addition falling on the families that can least afford it very often, right? That's the annual sort of direct spending number. I should add that, like I said, it does not these costs do not fall totally equally across people. For Black people, the cost of a family member being incarcerated is significantly higher. It's 2.5 times the amount spent by white family members, and is speaks to one of the drivers of the of upper mobility for Black people in this country, and certainly a major driver of the racial wealth gap, which we're all too familiar with.
Yeah, and I mean, for the federal poverty line is drawn at what, like $15,600, something like that. I don't have the exact number. So when you talk about something that's like $4,000 and change per year for families that are only bringing in like 15, $16,000, that's a huge percentage of somebody's income, especially for marginalized communities. And so we see this sort of magnification of impacts on the poorest members of our society as it relates to the criminal legal system. I mean, we see that at every step of the way, right? How poor people in marginalized communities, vulnerable community members, are so disproportionately impacted by the way our legal system works. And I mean, when I read that in your report, I was just kind of blown away, because that literally means that like someone is making a decision. Do I send money to help my loved one have tampons or have a fan, or do I provide food for my children or get
Hmm.
my child a jacket? And it becomes this horrific decision making, because the truth is the person on the inside is entirely dependent on support from family, or
Hmm.
again they go without. And so it's really, as but then again, of course, people at home are entirely dependent on that person. So it's really, we create these horrible decision points for people. It's cruel. It's really cruel when you think about who it's impacting the most.
Yes, I think that you said it well when you said that we're forcing people to make really impossible decisions that are from all that we know about our incarceration rates, and all that we know about how unnecessarily high they are. We're forcing people unnecessarily, right, to make these impossible decisions about their children, and what kind of opportunities they can offer them, and then their loved one, and what safety they can offer them, and security, and basic health that they can offer them while they are incarcerated. So not to mention many other choices when you're talking about some of these phone call bills, and talking about uh, the markups on things like body wash, which are just like double as high inside as they are at the local drugstore. These are decisions that we shouldn't be forcing families to make ever, and certainly as we are reckoning with more and more in this country with what I think many people are calling an affordability crisis, right? And persistent economic precarity. This is a storyline that deserves significantly more attention, because what a wasteful way to be exacerbating these crises of affordability, when unnecessary additional pain point that we could be avoiding.
Yeah, and 100%, right? I mean, and again, I don't think, because prison is so opaque, so many people don't know about all of these costs. But you had mentioned the children, and one of the like sort of heartbreaking aspects of your report was talking about how familial incarceration really impacts children sort of specifically and differently than it impacts others. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So there's been, we're so glad that there's been increased attention on this over the last decade or more. People who have been better understanding the incarceration crisis as it and mass incarceration as it impacts the children of people who are incarcerated. And I think there's a lot more research that we need, and a lot more investigation, and certainly policy focus on it. But what we have found in this study in particular is, and just to say sort of more broadly, what's now known to be true is that the children of incarcerated people are, in addition to being displaced from a parent and separated from a parent, are subject to all kinds of additional uh, um, interruptions and harms, including from mental health to sort of education trajectories, uh, actual physical health. And so you're sending kid down a trajectory, and putting obstacles in front of them that, I think we are just beginning to sort of understand that the tip of what they are. In this particular report, we looked at those costs, the sort of those consequences in a financial light. And I think a few things were really stark. One of the things that commanded a lot of my attention was that the earning trajectory, so like that lost earnings number that we talk about, where we say like, oh, some of this $350 billion that families pay or spend or lose, um, is due to lost earnings, and you can sort of understand the lost earnings of the person who's incarcerated. What we found really interesting and under discussed were the lost earnings and the reduced earnings of the other family members. And so maybe dad is incarcerated, maybe mom now has to take on additional childcare, can't actually do many hours at her job, and so you can see how that might play out, right? However, what's pretty astonishing is that those children that might have been, you know from eight, they might be 8 to, I don't know, 18 or something when dad was incarcerated. That incarceration, when you control for it, actually reduces their lifetime earnings throughout the course of their life. So a big part of that 350 billion is the reduced earnings related to the fact that of parental incarceration that those children are experiencing well into the future. They're just sent down a trajectory of smaller earnings throughout their life. And that has all kinds of implications for security and for our future and for sort of what we're investing in. So I think it's a area that deserves a lot of attention.
What's the explanation for that? Like, why would a child who has a parent who's incarcerated, why would the child have a reduced future potential earning?
I think what we know is that it's true, and I think we have a lot of hypotheses about it. What we know is that that is true, and then what we also know is that there's a lot of studies that talk about uh, educational trajectories that are harmed by parental incarceration, mental health trajectories that are harmed by parental incarceration. Throughout this process, as I spoke to some children and people who had experienced parental incarceration, I also heard stories about just sort of like loss of, for lack of a better term, professional guidance. I have a friend who told a story about um, his dad, being extremely skilled mechanic, and his brother not benefiting from that skill set. Right. So like I don't know, for all your listeners, but for me, I had the benefit of growing up with two parents who, eh, you know, helped me out in so many ways. If I think about my career now, I think about so many places where they stepped in to provide support, whether it was an introduction or encouragement to do a summer job or a help with a resume. Right? There's just like the literal fact of not having that support. I think also probably plays a role.
Right. And then again, it's also just, finances in terms of being able to complete school or go on to higher
Of
education.
course.
It's all of that. Yeah, it was a stunning thing to read and think about how by incarcerating a parent who often comes from a marginalized or poor community, you are almost ensuring that the upward mobility, the American dream that, so many folks have been sold is just not available. And so we're replicating these patterns of poverty and exclusion just by incarcerating a parent in a family. right? I mean, that's really it's an extraordinary thing that happens and that we don't necessarily think about. We just think, oh, we're holding this person responsible for their crime and we're punishing them for the harm that they caused. And we're not really stepping back and saying, well, who are we really harming by using prison as the mechanism for accountability, right?
Right. Correct. Yes. I think that we're just beginning to understand all the collateral damage that these incarceration rates are doing to so much in this country, but certainly to our economic thriving.
Yeah, and then, you had talked a little bit about how race plays out in your study, and it is astonishing the difference between what Black families, wind up paying. It's you said it's twofold, right, over what white families pay. So
Hmm.
again and again, that doesn't that again sort of replicates, amplifies the impact of poverty, but it also mirrors what we see in the criminal justice system. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, there was so much that was interesting and of note about this. So first of all, Black family members are spending 2.5 times as much, so around $8,000, as white family members who spend around $3,200 every year. Um, and then in addition to that, so like that's a very high number, and also we know that Black family members are more likely to have family members who are in prison for longer periods of time because of all the racial disparities that are pervasive across the criminal justice system. Those also mean that Black people spend longer incarcerated than white people do for the same crime and overall. And so we talk about an annual number, right? But that annual number is being experienced, for more years if you are a Black family than if you are a white family. One of the things that we thought was extremely interesting was that Black families just spend more on their incarcerated family member than white families do. Just not, not the time, just literally inside of a year, they just spend more um, per person. And that we found that to be really interesting. And we hope people look into that and learn a lot more about that just relative uh, generosity and relative sort of care that is happening in parts of the Black community who are feeling they have to hold up their family members who are incarcerated in ways that are just like factually sort of larger than what white families and other races do.
Huh, I mean, that is so interesting, and I'd love to know a little bit more about that seemingly relative generosity, or if that's where it's coming from, if it's coming from that, or if it's coming from the idea that maybe folks who are white who are incarcerated have some higher level. Again, I don't want to overstate higher level, but higher level of capital to begin with when they go in. Like, it's an interesting question.
It's an
Um,
interesting question. Yeah, I think what we have is just the information, and it's controlled for enough things that we know that just like these two sort of groups are just spending differently, even per person, even inside of a year. And so I think all of that is a really sort of it's potentially like a lot of richness to dig deeper in.
Yeah, and I was struck. I what for folks who are going to go and look into this report, you'll also see an accompanying video, and it was a really wonderful conversation between a number of different people who have family members who are incarcerated. And I remember one of the women in the video. She was an African American woman, and she said she viewed sending money to her loved one as an investment in hope. And I thought that was so powerful. What do you think she meant when she said that, that was an investment in hope?
Yes, I encourage you all to watch that video. You can find it at wecan'taffordit.us. It's called Tax on Love, and we heard a lot from family members throughout this process in our focus groups and elsewhere who talked about this as something that they felt was extremely important contribution to their loved ones, and that it was their way of showing up for people that were otherwise forgotten by society and by our laws, and that it was really important to show up in these ways. The person who says that that comment that you referenced, Jessica, that it's an investment in hope, is Ashley Gant, who also wrote the forward to our report, and you could read it again at the same we can't afford it.us. She is our campaigns and advocacy manager here at forward.us, and she spent some of her life supporting her father while he was incarcerated, supporting him financially and supporting some other family members. And she tells a really incredible story about the impossible choices that she had to make as a young mother, and also as someone who was supporting incarcerated people, and but that, how important it was to make sure that in a place designed to strip away sort of his dignity and humanity, that she was validating it by investing in him and showing up for him. So I encourage you all to read that, and to watch the video. I think we found that part of this story really, really moving.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing for, a lot of the times on Just Justice, we're talking about sort of these permanent life sentences, life without parole, virtual life sentences, or just plain old life, but, where people can't get out on parole or whatever. But the truth is, many people in our criminal legal system are there for a relatively short period of time. And, if they are inside without support, they come out quickly, but much more traumatized. And so that doesn't serve anybody either. And particularly for the family members to whom they're going to return, it's really important that they keep their loved one kind of shored up so that the person who comes home to them is able to reconnect and, in meaningful ways, in positive, productive ways.
There's been actually just a ton of evidence about how important it is, for example, to if you're focusing on recidivism, for example, how important family visitation is and family connection is in the form of phone calls or other things. There's been a lot of study in this over the years, and yet we tax it, right? We allow private companies to charge a lot of money for phone calls, for emails, for commissary. We don't we like sort of incarcerate people far away with not a lot of regard to where they live, where they're coming from, and so people are having to spend a fortune to go out and see their family members, and pay for hotels, and pay for gas, and pay for all these things. And so this thing that we know will help the people who are incarcerated, the family members who are at home, and also just like for societal reasons, like keep recidivism low, and decrease it. We're not only not investing in, we are actually sort of like setting up barriers to it.
Yeah, we're undermining it all. And I thought it was so interesting your use of the term family tax, right? I mean, that's in the title. Where did you come up with that idea, right? Because it's not actually a tax, right? Our taxpayers in our states go to pay our state correctional systems. Some of our federal dollars go to support the Bureau of Prisons and all the things that happen at the federal prison level. But these are decisions people are making, right, to pay. But you came up with the term family tax, and I loved that. And I wondered, like, what made you view it in that way?
I mean, you can see them as decisions. I think what we see them as, we see these things that sort of, some of them are not decisions. Some of them are like lost income and earnings that you can't do anything about. And then some of them are things that like we don't think should be decisions, like whether or not you pay for a copay for a life-saving treatment for someone behind bars, right? Like whether or not you pay for basic nutritional food, or whether or not you pay to keep someone warm. So for us, I think it was the hidden tax that is not being counted when we talk about the tax that
Mhm,
taxpayers pay, right? That
mhm.
this is how much incarceration costs, right? Like it also includes this. It's what it costs, and we're not sort of thinking about it when we hand down these extremely long sentences, for example.
Yeah, yeah. And two more things I think I just want to go back over. So, this whole idea about the emails and calls, that's been addressed a little bit, right? What's the latest? So, for folks who don't know, it used to be literally a fortune. Like, I don't even know how much per call, but it was outrageous how expensive it was for people to make calls or to keep in touch with their loved ones. And there has been some movement on that, right?
There has. I have to shout out the extraordinary work that's been done by Worth Rises. If people haven't been following it, Bianca Tylek and The organization she founded, Worth Rises, has been just doing absolutely prolific and powerful work in partnership with so many different community groups and organizations across the country to try to take on so many predatory and privatized practices across the criminal justice system, but inclusive of these communication practices that have hiked up fees and for so many family members for so long, and they've had a lot of luck in states and localities, not everywhere, moving states into places where they're making phone calls free, for example, which is just extraordinary. And other places, they've had luck just with in federal reforms, getting it regulated so that there can't be as much as of a hike up. And so there have been victories there. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of work to do, and certainly encourage listeners to get involved in those campaigns and get educated about the work that they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, because it's really, I don't think people know about that, but it's stunning how expensive, or how unfairly expensive prisons have made some of these sort of basic communication methods for people who are incarcerated. Um, and so, here we are. We have $348 billion in estimated total costs per year. Think about that for a minute. Think about what we could do with that. So, what are you suggesting? What is Forward's vision in calculating this unbelievable cost to families from incarceration?
I think for us, so listen, our vision is a safe and really significant reduction in incarceration in this country. We think that it is extremely possible. We can see just from looking at the comparison in the laboratories of the states, right? In the laboratories of democracy, we know that it is possible because you can look at states that incarcerate at much different levels in states than other states, that we can come down dramatically. And even in the states that have the lowest incarceration rates in this country, we know you can come down dramatically from where we are. So we are choosing against the evidence to maintain these extremely high, indefensibly high incarceration rates. So for us, this is intended to be in another motivator to get back to work. And there has been so much progress on this, but there needs to be so much more progress in this. I'll just say really briefly for folks that feel pessimistic and feel like things, good things can't happen, that like since the peak of incarceration in 2008, the incarcerated population has fallen by almost a quarter, right? That is an astonishing achievement for a justice reform movement inside of just a short period of time. The Black imprisonment rate has dropped by one half. That's astonishing. Is it too high? Are there still persistent racial disparities? Is the overall incarceration rate far too high? Absolutely. But like, oh my God, what can we, look what can be done when people kind of roll up their sleeves and get to work. And that's what we saw happen from 2000 until even now, is just so many individuals, and largely sort of spurred on by the people who were coming home from prison, the people still inside of prison, their family members who were sort of ringing the alarm bell and getting to work and organizing advocates and chambers of commerce and their elected leaders, and so many people from ballots in California to Supreme Court cases to legislative work in almost every single country and sorry, every single state, whether they be red governed, blue governed, purple governed. There really hasn't been a place that has escaped this sort of life changing and life saving reform trajectory. I think what I worry about is that trajectory has sort of changed a bit of late. Like the sort of decline has begun to level out a bit and maybe even tip back up in recent years. It's not clear to me